All right, so before we get into today's episode, I just wanted to mention an opportunity that will be coming to Calgary the weekend of the 10th and 11th. That is the Team Aita seminar, both powerlifting and weightlifting, that will cover 2 days. You can purchase them individually or you can purchase both as a super total option. Max, what could they expect from the seminars?
You're going to learn the technique of all the lifts: squat, bench, deadlift, snatch, clean and jerk. We're going to teach you progressions to do them yourselves, to teach them to other people. You'll learn exercises to address weak points in all 5 lifts. You'll learn a little bit of programming, basically how to design a program for yourself and how to address your weak points, how to construct something that's going to be helpful for you.
Yeah, most importantly, you get a Q&A with all three of us, including Joe and Ada. So check the link in the description down below, and we hope to see you there. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. My name is Joshua Gibson. I'm your host, and I'm joined today by the people's dad. I don't know if Seb's going to be mad that I use that moniker for you, but how are you doing, Max?
I'm doing pretty well, yeah.
Yeah, joined by longtime friend, the incredible Bulk. Just slight change on that. Mike Tuchscherer. How you doing, Mike?
Good to be here.
Yeah, I feel like this is a really dynamic combo because the Reactive Training Systems podcast that Mike hosts had Max on it a couple of times, and those are just dynamite episodes. So if people haven't checked those out, there's one that talks about training as a skill. There's one about lessons in high intensity. Those are just fantastic episodes. So I really implore people to go listen to those. Not before you finish this. It's the most important podcast. But yeah, maybe we can just get into things, Mike, with you kind of bringing us up to speed with where you're at, what you're doing. I know you're in Washington right now, kind of traveling around.
Yeah, well, sort of. We moved up here, so we're in this process of getting settled. Which, I mean, when you say you move to a new place, I think a lot of people kind of envision like, well, it's a weekend or a week or something, and there, you're moved, right?
Right.
For us, that's not really how it goes. We're working on like month 3 of kind of settling
Wow.
in,
Wow.
because I mean, we've got 4 kids at this point, so there's a lot to move. Like the process of uprooting in one spot and then rooting in another spot is kind of lengthy. So
Yeah.
we're kind of in the middle of that.
I've never actually, I'm kind of, it's a personal question, but I don't think I've ever really seen like a lot of posting. Like, does your wife lift at all? Or like, it's funny, like I've never actually like thought like I've seen like a lot of posting about like your family and stuff. And like some people don't, I don't personally like to post a lot on social media about my family, but yeah, I was curious, like, does she lift or did she lift ever?
She ran track when we were in college.
Okay.
She was a sprinter, but in the time since then, I mean, she's been a personal trainer but kind of worked out like a normal person. Hasn't really gotten into barbell sports, I would say.
Right.
But yeah, and I definitely intentionally don't post a lot of family stuff. Like a quote here or there, like a funny anecdote maybe, but I don't do a lot of pictures and stuff. We've had some not so nice experiences.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been a lot of years ago now, but it doesn't take too many of those. And you're like, you know what? I don't really need to drag them into this,
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And speaking of posting on social media, 2 things that you guys aren't especially known for. How did you and Max actually get to know each other, become like friends, and then get into doing the podcast together?
Gosh, that's
That's a good
way back.
question.
I guess that's through Juggernaut, maybe.
I think I met you. I don't. I think the first time I met you was definitely like at like a Raw Nationals, like officially. But
Yeah.
I remember reading. I remember following you on YouTube when you were your account. What was your account name? Something like something 275.
Yeah.
Like it was like this is a long time ago. You were like posting stuff from your basement or garage. You always had a Tendo unit. But it had like really like probably I don't know how many years
Like
ago.
unedited videos.
Yeah.
That just would be like,
Yeah.
45 seconds of breathing followed by 10
Right.
seconds
And I
of-
remember you won the World Games, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
so I remember
nice.
that. Like, I don't know how long ago that was, but like, yeah, I knew of Mike for since basically since I can remember because it was like RPE, like the RPE stuff, the tendo and like velocity stuff that you were like talk about your training in a really thoughtful way. And like just remember following that. And I bought the what was it, the RTS manual.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah,
Didn't it come with a CD?
yeah, yeah. It
Yeah,
did.
so funny, the other day I was cleaning out some boxes. We had our house renovated a few months back,
Yeah.
and I found that CD, and I was like, "Oh man, I wish I could play this. I don't have a CD player. Like, I have no DVD. I can't actually physically use this medium." That's how long
Right.
ago I remember. That's how long ago Mike's been in this. But yeah, so I remember that was I remember how long
Yeah,
ago was that? It's
man.
well over
People.
10 years.
Yeah, some people thought like it was music a few times, but it's like no, it's their spreadsheets.
So that book wasn't like the Lillibridge method where the last
No,
6 pages were just music recommendations.
no music recommendations in there.
Yeah, I'd be interested. I don't know if you guys could explore this, but I feel like you two. I mean, knowing how Max does things from a programming standpoint, Mike knowing kind of how you guys do things, it's not that you two diverge necessarily or completely separate, but I think there's just a difference in terms of like exercise prescription. And then I know Mike, you went down like the kind of Bondarchuk-esque like methodology.
Yeah,
Um, Max, maybe you can talk a bit about what you think of how Mike does things, and then maybe
Well,
Mike, we can get you to like riff on more of like the classical ways of doing things.
I'd actually be curious to know where you're at with the emerging strategies. From we had a conversation years ago with Jacob Sipkin, and I remember that being like to me, I feel like I'm always looking for trying to understand things more, but also like with the when you're young, you sort of understand that you're looking for like what's the right answer, right? You believe that there's like, oh, there's one best way or there's one right way to do things. And as you get more experienced, you see things and experience stuff that just like is contradictory to that. And so, you kind of grow and adapt your thought process or methodology. Um, I think some people get to a point where they stop that process. They find and I tell Josh this a lot, like they find a recipe and they're like, oh, okay, this is the recipe that works. We do tens, then fives, then threes, then, we peak. And okay, that works for like maybe a huge population of people, right? Beginners, newbies, like it kind of just is this recipe that's chocolate chip cookies, right? And everyone likes it. But it's not really the development of a system, which is sort of rooted in principles and like identifying the principles of training and then building a system on top of that, which is just a representation of those principles in the
yeah,
form of a program and decision making trees and those kind of things. And you definitely are someone who has gone that full direction. Like where like I would imagine if I have a conversation with you in 5 years or 10 years, you probably have new thoughts and new decisions, right? You didn't just figure out the recipe and that's it. And yeah, so like that conversation we had a long time ago was really cool to me because like I had a lot of the same thoughts and Jacob and you, and we were kind of just talking about like, this idea of like kind of vague idea of like applying basically like the same stimulus again and again and again, like microcycle to microcycle or session to session, and looking at how people have maybe an individual response to that, their adaptation to that stimulus is different from person to person. And obviously, I would say you from here could understand, you could take that and explain kind of where you went with that to where you're at now.
yeah, yeah. So that's a good jumping off point, and like I mentioned, kind of before we got started, I tend to think of it these days, especially as more of a epistemological system than a system around physiology or exercise science. In fact, it's kind of a joke on the team that everything is emerging strategies. Like we'll talk about something completely unrelated, like the way you raise your kids, or how much detergent do you put in the laundry, or like literally anything, and you can apply this emerging strategies framework to it. It's just basically controlled observations and leaning on those observations to make decisions in the future. Not being tethered too much to what ought to be, and instead
Right.
really trying to focus on what is. Like, what do you, okay, yeah, that's how it's supposed to work, but does it really do what you think? Or is there maybe some detail that's not quite right, and that's, you may not even be aware of what that detail would be, but it could cause the whole system to go in a different direction. uh, you still have to live with that and make the adjustments. But yeah, I mean, when the rubber meets the road, kind of the starting point is the same microcycle uh, on repeat for as long as that's showing us some sort of adaptation, right? So same exercises, same sets, same reps, same RPE. So we can adjust the weight a little bit up and down based on performance. But we're, like you said, we're trying to deliver the same stimulus. And so this week is the same. Next week is going to be the same. And then if we're adapting, hopefully, ideally, we can see the weights going up a little bit from one week to the next. But that'll stop at some point, and that's when you make a change. You make a fairly significant change to the whole program. Um, but then you start to learn, okay, these types of things get us that trending response, and those types of things don't. And then you can continue to take it further and further. And kind of where I'm at with it now is, looking at sequences of blocks. All right, I understand what can get us to, like, what do our most successful blocks look like? Okay, so how do we string together a sequence of 2 or 3 blocks that is more successful than other sequences of blocks? And it's not just peeking into the competition, but more of the development side of things. And I am bringing in more, like leaning more on my understanding of exercise science, physiology, stuff like that. I would say that that's one mistake that I made early on in the teaching of emerging strategies, was I kind of downplayed the importance of that. But I had 15 years of thinking about that stuff behind me, so I think it was, yeah, if you don't have, not saying you got to do it for 15 years, but if you don't have some kind of base, then you really are adrift more than I thought you would be. But like in that kind of initial example, it's hold some variables constant and see what the output is. And the variables that we held constant in that case were exercises, sets, reps, RPE, and the output being your performance. You could hold other variables constant as well. Maybe instead of sets, reps, RPE, you held constant a certain stress index, or a certain total volume, or whatever you thought was important. You could hold different things constant, and now you're kind of asking the system a different question, and you may get a slightly different output. And I'm kind of dabbling with some of that stuff too. It creates some interesting, like, dynamic loading systems, so that it's not so monotonous. I mean, we didn't really have a huge problem with monotony anyway, but it is nice to have workouts that are a bit different. Oh, today's a high volume day. Tomorrow's a low volume day, and it's for a reason. It's not just arbitrarily picked. It's
Right.
like, well, this is where my workload baselines are, and so that's just kind of how the math works out.
That's really cool. One of the interesting things that I think about, like with emerging strategies, that to me is so cool, is like it's a departure from like, I guess, this like heavily relied upon structure, which is to say, okay, we bounce between points of, low volume, high volume, and deloading. And essentially, like, I think the big picture, people do that arbitrarily. They say, every fourth week we deload, or every 6th week we deload. and it's essentially just some arbitrary decision. A more advanced way would be like, having volume landmarks that you bounce between, right? Minimum effective volume to maximum recoverable volume, and defining those points more clearly. But, even that, only it's still only in principle getting at the idea that you're moving between a period of like, you're going to start making adaptations to this, start responding to this stress, and you're going to not respond to this stress anymore. And with emerging strategy, it seems to be that that's the primary thing that's trying to be achieved, which is, let's follow the curve of this adaptation from the beginning of implementing a stress to the end of that stress, or to the final result of that, and then pivot. And the cool thing about it is that it's not arbitrary in the sense that like you're just picking some predetermined length of time, right?
Yeah.
It seems like you're basically looking at actual data and performance to make those decisions, right?
Yeah.
And the cool thing about it is that it could potentially capture a situation that's counterintuitive. So perhaps somebody's performance immediately decreases when they get a stress imposed on them, but then gradually rises and increases over the next 6 or 8 weeks or something. And you'd capture that in this system, whereas a traditional system, that may not be the case. You might look at somebody and be like, oh, hey, their performance has decreased, too much volume, too much intensity, change this, like try to solve something that's not actually a problem, it's just a natural response. So
Yeah.
it's like really cool that there's a system that is looking at it from that perspective, right? From
Yeah. Well, I'll kind of, I think part of the point of this conversation is to push beyond what the stuff that we've already talked about, right?
Yeah.
So, kind of with that knowledge in mind, one thing that I've noticed more lately is that we'll make some blocks, especially like when you start dabbling with these sequences, right? So you've got kind of level the doctrinal emerging strategies stuff. I really harp on keep the goal the goal. The goal is your improvement in 1RM, so keep focused on that. Did it improve your 1RM or not? And I think that's fine when you're looking at that uh, kind of first level response. You did this development block. Did it make an improvement or not? Did this exercise correlated with improvements in performance or not? Further down the road, like say you've got that stuff sorted, you know, now you're looking at maybe a sequence of blocks, and now you're doing a block that isn't necessarily supposed to drive your 1RM up. It's supposed to potentiate
Yeah.
next block or something like that. That I've seen more often where you won't get much, if any, improvement in 1RM during that block, but you'll see something else measurable. Like you definitely want a measurable outcome, but it'll be like an improvement in rep capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're tracking, let's talk about a specific example. Let's say the bench press, and the benchmark workout for your bench press is say a single at 7 or 8 RPE, followed by a 70% AMRAP. So this is a workout that I did in earlier this year, April May timeframe. I wrote an article about it because I had a really good result from it as well. Um, so like that initial single is very specific to your competition performance, and so you can see, yeah, not much is happening there. I'm about the same strength week over week, but you can also get a very accurate picture of where your 70% is. But now you see that 70% AMRAP is improving. So
Mm-hmm.
it's 70%, but in week 1 you did 10, and in week 4 or 5 you did 12. So mm, that's a significant improvement to me. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so that's a measurable outcome. That's not necessarily the thing that you would care about in terms of like your powerlifting performance. That tells you something. Does it tell you something about like what you should peak with? Yeah, probably not that. you know,
Yeah.
but it also tells you something else. Like, okay, so there was a measurable outcome. Does that lead to some other improvement in the next block or in the next couple blocks or something like that.
Right.
I wonder if you have found a reliable, like a reliable change that would tell you that, like, hey, the next block's going to be successful. So you mentioned something like work capacity, right? The ability to do more work with the same weight. Is that like consistently the thing that potentiates like 1RM, or have you found anything that can kind of give you that guide of, if we do this block, the next block we'll see a bigger improvement?
I wouldn't. I expect that it would, but if you were like, "Hey, Mike, I don't believe you, prove it," I have a hard time proving it with my own data at this point, because it takes a long time to get, and the data is always really messy, just because
Mhm.
individual programs are really messy. So you get you run this experiment a dozen times, and 3 people got sick, and then those people
Right.
Yeah.
took vacation in the middle of it, all the other stuff, right? And then so and so, it just, you end up with a sample of 5 programs. Well, is it just that there's a small sample there, or
Right.
it's hard to draw those conclusions just yet from the actual data. But yeah, I mean, I would expect that, to quote the great Mark Bell, the strength is never a weakness, right?
Yeah. It's better than quoting Liver King. Or is it? Yeah. This is interesting because that kind of idea, and maybe this sounds kind of similar. I know, like, I've spoken to like Sean Waxman, and he had an interesting strategy where, like, sometime after like the sort of specific prep phase in training, they would have a short block of training that was like maybe 7 days, maybe 10 days, where it was really high intensity, like partials from blocks, like partial pulls and deadlifts and heavy lifts. And his rationale was that he felt like he saw this significant increase in the peaking phase after that.
Hmm.
And it kind of like that, I think maybe is like too short a period of time. I don't know, but it's interesting to think about that. Like when you also look at something like maybe depth jumps, where you might have like a long-term delayed effect from the exercise. So maybe there's a block of like depth jumps, 4 weeks out. It ends 4 weeks before the competition or 3 weeks before competition. And there's a noticeable improvement because there's this sort of like, you know, delayed effect from that. Not quite the same as like you're talking about with like a potentiation, but it's interesting that like something like that is sort of, yeah, it's an interesting idea that like you have this block or this period that maybe has an indirect effect that you don't expect, or an indirect effect that is beneficial, that's not something you would logically be like, oh yeah, that makes a ton of sense to do this right now and have this effect happen, later on in the training cycle.
Yeah, the indirect effects and delayed effects always blow my mind, especially like when we start talking about periods of multiple weeks. I think like, man, what's going on there from an
Right.
adaptation standpoint?
Yeah.
Like all the time course of these adaptations that we typically talk about are like over in a number of days at the most.
Right.
And man, like a long-term adaptation like that is kind of fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
It's very weird to me. It's very interesting, like just the whole idea that like there's there's stuff going on inside your body,
mhm,
for
yeah.
this, like these weeks where it's like it may even seem like you have session after session in between those time periods. It's like you stop training that seemingly doesn't interfere, or those adaptations don't interfere, and then all of a sudden there's this this spike in performance or whatever it is. Like it's very interesting to me. That is a really
Well,
unique
they
thing.
old head powerlifters used to talk about stuff like that too, like only being able to deadlift every 2 weeks, or um, kind of the heavy partials idea there again, but only doing them every other week, or
Yeah.
something along those lines, because it just takes you that long to recover, is kind of how they would frame it. But again, you have this problem like, wait a second, what is going on there that it would take that long to, recover? What do we mean by that? I mean, that's the other thing too. Like words like fatigue and recovery are kind of catch-all terms, and they mean a lot of different things.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to get into the nitty-gritty without being more specific, and I struggle to be more specific than that a lot of times.
So is the training process kind of this thing by which you stumble upon a change, like an effect like that, and then you just try to exploit it? Like, so I'm thinking if it's like an unpredictable thing, you just deadlift super infrequently, and suddenly you make great progress for some reason. It's like the only way you really figure that out is by accidentally doing it. I don't think anyone ever thinks like maybe if I deadlift once every 3 weeks, I'll get better. I don't know if like, or if I do like depth jumps, a month out, like you would have to have something that would either push you to that, or you got really sick and you took a bunch of time off and you ended up doing really well. So it's like, oh, maybe there is something to having an extended break.
I mean, I hope it's not completely random, right? Because if it is, then I mean, I guess I'm still like providing some value in terms of pattern recognition, but like you would hope that a lot of the value here comes from being able to proactively work through some of this stuff. So I hope there is a logic to it. I think there is. I certainly operate as if there is some logic to it. And I think an understanding of, what we know about exercise science or physiology or any of that stuff can give you those nudges, but it's still like this process of implement it and see, did it work in the real world? Because, there's always anomalous results, and those anomalies are really important to the people that they happen to.
So how would you tease them out? Because to the individual, right, there can be something wildly different from the average just based on how outliers work. But it's like, how do you find the outlying thing if it's so far different from the average?
I mean, the ones that are like super weird do take a while. We've definitely had people that end up on programs that I think, man, I'd never would have. Like if you just showed me this program and said, hey, is this a good program? I never would have thought that this would be the ticket for anybody, but here we are, and it does, like, I do feel good that we can do that. To me, that's been like the athlete response is the most important thing. It's more important to me. It should be more important than my systems or anything like that. So the systems that I make need to be able to come up with those answers that I wouldn't have necessarily come up with myself. But unfortunately, though, in those cases, we're not very good at diagnostics, I would say.
Yeah.
Like we can't look at a person and be like, oh yeah, you need to go like way out of left field. Sometimes you can get nudges, but often it's this problem of continual problem solving. Nope, you got beat up on that too. Well, shit, I guess we'll lower the volume some more.
Right.
And soon, oh, okay, so this seems to be the ticket. Is like we've got a few people on just like some crazy low volumes, like which would be like the equivalent of like 5 hard sets a week for all of their lower body training. It'll be like 5 hard sets a week.
Wow.
And I mean, that's really low. Like that's accessories, that's everything. Everything is that, and if you do any more than that, they're just beat to hell, and you can't bring the RPE up, because if you bring the RPE up past a 6, then they fall apart. And you think, like, on one hand you go, man, you're really not cut out for this. But on the other hand, like, this is what you want to do. So who am I to tell you to stop?
Yeah.
Right.
So here's an interesting question then so like the sort of emerging strategies approach would be to say, take the same stimulus and apply it to somebody, keeping that constant and finding the athlete response to that. So what I would say methods do you have for the system adapting or changing to those things? Like, is it just a matter of like do a cycle or do a block of training, and then how do you evaluate it, and then what variables do you change, or what is the methodology for how to go about like refining the system or iterating on it?
Yeah. So we have a process that we do called block review, where we'll run a report on the training log basically, and it'll aggregate a bunch of information for us and try to make it a little bit more easily digestible. But at that point, you're really problem solving, and you get a lot of people that will say, "Hey, my squat E1RM went up 7 kilos in this block. Is that good?" Well, I don't know if it's good. Is it better than anything else you've tried so far? Then it's pretty
Right.
good.
Yeah.
If it's not as good as the other stuff you've tried, then it's not that good. So it's always got to be looked at in context. Um, and like along with that, like the emerging strategy stuff works really well if we can keep like the signal to noise ratio
Yeah.
under control. You get people that have like a lot of like life stress, ER doctors and stuff like that, scheduling chaos. It makes things more difficult to parse, and you always have to be aware of that stuff too. So you're still at the like, even though you try to make it fairly stepwise, and you can run these reports and try to pull data, you're still left with needing to make decisions on what's the important stuff to pay attention to and what's not. You try to aggregate it so that you distill some of this information down so it's easier to point to the stuff that actually matters, but you still have to say, we're going to throw that block out because your kid was in the hospital,
Right.
and so training was a wreck, or whatever. So we're just not even going to consider that in our calculus. You still have to be able to do stuff like that, and sometimes those lines are pretty blurry. Like we have these conversations, and the exceptions to the rule are always like these very clear cut things, like, oh, you lost your job, your kid's in the hospital,
Right. Right.
whatever, very clear cut. But in reality, it's like these borderline cases of like, no, it's a stressful time, we're just really busy, the kids are in hockey or whatever. It's like, well, do we throw that out, or is that's actually good data because that represents your life? This is just your life. You have a lot of stress going on.
Right.
You know?
Right. It's interesting too, because like a lot of like what my interest is and has shifted, having built the app and gone through this process of like what I want to do is create a machine that allows me to get better answers more so than like, oh, I'm going to make the perfect program.
Yeah.
It's almost like I want at some point I want the AI stuff to have the least input from me as possible so that we can draw the most data out of it and do something with it usefully, where it's like so easy to just sort of like, okay, I've got the answers, they're all right, here it is, versus saying, okay, like I always think about it like I want to find out all the ways I'm wrong. Like
Yeah.
I want to just constantly find out that I'm wrong about everything, because then I can just sort of become less wrong with gathering data and gathering more information that can help inform that. And
Oh,
it's
100%. Totally agree with that
yeah, right. It's funny
mentality.
because oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just saying, I totally agree with that mentality.
It's funny because a lot of it too now becomes like, okay, it's less about like what are the hyper specific details about building a program that I need to have versus how can I make a system that finds its way to a better program, right? And honestly, like the emerging strategies thing is probably the most like of things I can think of. Like it's probably the most sort of fundamentally focused on that problem, which is to say, how do you find a better training system or better training method with somebody? Because you could just have like, stamped out programs you write based on plenty of great information and they're good. And when they fail, you don't have like, there may not be a strategy to find out where it's wrong, right? Or what's, what can be less wrong about it. But it's interesting because then your decision making about how to design something comes down to like, okay, well, let's figure out all of the possible variables. And then we have all these variables. How can we manipulate them, or what should indicate a manipulation of a variable, right? And so it's like,
So
okay, yeah,
over the last, I don't know how long. So we have a system on our website called the track system that
mm-hmm.
has been there for ever, since we had a website, really. And it's a means for us to gather information from the athletes on like their subjective recovery. Well, a long time ago, pretty much as soon as it was developed, I developed a spreadsheet version of it because I can tinker with it,
Yeah,
And so I would like build these little additions onto it and change things and tinker with stuff and tweak it. So I've been working on this thing for like a decade,
yeah,
and now it's like grown into like a load management system.
right,
And like I've been using it with some, it's still not super polished, so it's not one of these things that's for everybody, but there's a few people I'm like trialing it out with to see. But like talking about like these little variables, when you start doing stuff like that, you realize how many decision making points there are, and
yeah,
how many like arbitrary lines in the sand get
Yeah.
drawn by a coach. Like, hey coach, I'm really feeling beat up today. Should I make any adjustments to the program? And you're going to say, yeah, we're going to drop a set here, whatever. How do you make those decisions? And like, how would you systematically make those decisions? And man, there's so many, like, you just kind of check the wind and yeah, that looks about right.
yeah, yeah,
And we're going to draw the line at 59%, and somebody comes in at 58%, and you go, why did I draw it at 59? Because this person's like right underneath the cutoff. And I mean, should it be 58 instead? Like, well, you have no idea. Like a lot of this stuff is based on just your experience, like
yeah,
I don't want to like write it off as like too flippantly, because it's not nothing. It's not like you're just making stuff up. But when you kind of come down to it and you're like, why is that the dividing line?
yep.
It gets tough.
So I realized a lot of my decision making when I started out this kind of process was a lot of the decisions I make are based in making myself feel okay with the decision. And so it's like, oh, okay, someone, X, Y, and Z happens in a session, or why did they get this exercise, or how much training volume? It's based in making me feel okay with the decision. And it's like that's kind of a strange thing. Like, so
Yeah.
it doesn't mean it's wrong. That's the other thing. It doesn't mean that those choices are wrong. Like, we're all successful coaches, right? Like, so you've made a lot of really good choices to get people to excel in the sports, but it's funny that, like, if you ask coaches, like, okay, like you do the 5-year-old experiment of like, well, why do you do this? And you eventually get down to like the answer a lot of times for a lot of decisions is like, well, because that seems right. And
Yeah.
that's like such a wild thought to me that, like, okay, yeah, it's weird. I kind of equate it to that thing with like, home run hitters. There was some sort of speculation that like people that hit home runs or could hit fastballs were, they had superior hand-eye coordination. And they kind of found that, eventually they didn't actually have better hand-eye coordination. It's that because they were big home run hitters, they often got pitched fastballs more frequently. And they had more experience in recognizing subconsciously the signals from some pitcher's body that he was going to throw a fastball. And so it's really just a matter of like they became better at recognizing that situation and better at timing, and they could hit the ball, right? And it's funny because it's like, well, that's like a completely subconscious thing. They might not, I mean, those guys are probably not aware of that happening.
Yeah.
They just can sense this is a fastball coming, and then, they react properly. And so it's like, how much of my coaching is just like, I've seen, you've seen a lot of people do a lot of things. And so you make a lot of good decisions based on the fact that you have all this experience the downside, the opposite side of that coin is like, how many decisions do I make are poor
Right.
because I have negative biases towards things? Like, it's funny. Like, why would we not do, some sets of 5 in the snatch or something? And it's just like this weird, like, when you stop and think about it, like, there's no logical, there's some logical arguments you could make, but it's like, I mean, I can understand, like, sure, sometimes that would make sense in some cases, but there's like a bias, there's a social
Yeah.
bias, there's a, like, I don't want to get laughed at by other coaches, or,
Right.
the jokes about this and that, like, then you have a negative bias towards it, and then you shift, and then it's like, that's my hope is that one day I will have no opinions about, like, very little opinions about the training program and the process, and
I
very
agree.
much like you'll be able to look at it as like, well, this is the process, this is the program that's working, right? And get away from some of those.
That's kind
There's
of why
been,
I
yeah,
wanted to build the system the way that I did as well, is because, like, in a lot of ways, I want to build a system that I would be happy to use,
mhm,
and I'm thinking like prime athletic points of my life, like would I have been happy to use this? And, you know, because the system says so is not going to be an adequate answer
yeah,
for me, like I want to be able to say like, okay, why 6 sets instead of 5 sets today? And I want there to
mhm,
be like an actual answer to that
yep,
question. It doesn't have to be like down to the physiology, but there is an answer, and like to that end, I think the idea of being less wrong is a really powerful idea when it comes to stuff like this, and specifically around this, uh, around the ideas of volume management and kind of how rapidly should you go about increasing volume, or um, you know if you this is kind of one of my favorite examples of this is you have an athlete who does the classic off program workout. So what do? Well, most coaches go, hey, don't do that again, you know um, just get back on the program and continue as normal. Or at most it'll be like you're going to need an extra rest day, so take a rest day and then get back on the program as normal. And I thought, like, if there were no restrictions, like if you had no biases in terms of stuff you had already written, time already spent, stuff like that, uh, is that really how you would handle it? And I thought, no, I would. This has some downstream impact, and it's a discrete downstream impact. It's
mhm,
if you go off program a little bit, you should have a little bit of an adjustment. You go off program a lot, you should have a bigger adjustment. You miss a workout, that should have an impact downstream. Like, oh, pretend that didn't happen. Get back on the program. I mean, that's not a terrible solution, you
yeah,
know. But it's like if you're really trying to eke out everything you can, you know, you can do better,
right,
and so like being able to capture that stuff and make the micro adjustments that you need to.
yeah,
That, I mean, it might not amount to much. It might amount to just like an extra set tomorrow, or 1 set less on Friday, or something like that. But I tend to think that those little decisions will add up to something
yeah.
down the road.
Yeah, I agree with that a lot. I think it's like, the benefit of having, like, a machine that's doing this, or the benefit of having like the tools we have at our disposal versus, like, writing in a notebook or something, or just kind of being in the gym coaching, really lends itself to the people that are focused on learning as much as possible and figuring, like, if you could manage 1,000 variables very easily, it just lends itself to being less wrong more and more times, right? And if you think about, like, creating training programs or coaching someone in a way that, like, was, you know, 10% better than it could have been without the management of those things, and they had some rate of progress that was, subtle but beneficial, you're going to have overall better, you have overall better system, and you're going to produce better athletes because you've got, you're managing these things in a way that, like, you can capture those tiny little things that happen. and
Yeah.
make, if it's an extra set or there's a downstream effect, and you have a process that is, oriented to answer that the right way, or maybe not the less wrong way, then you're going to capture a lot more of that potential alpha that exists there.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, it's cool to see. For me, it's cool to see that, like, there are still people in in this stuff that are focused on the future. Like, focused on, like, where can I be better in 5 years?
Yeah.
It's, like I was saying in the beginning too. It's like it's so common that it seems like there's a lot of, like, sort of, once you figure it out, like the recipe, it's kind of, that's it, and like, you know like, oh, it's a bad day. Like, someone had a bad day, or they had a bad meet, or whatever. So his shoes were tied too tight. That's why he missed his squat. Or
Right.
my favorite one is, like he misgrooved it. Like, he's,
Right.
he misgrooved it. Like, you've done 10,000 bench presses, but this one heavy one you misgrooved. Yeah, it's funny. Like, it's just, we become so ready to sort of dismiss a small thing that seems like, oh, that's just a little error. Like, no big deal. He just had a bad day. Versus, like, oh, maybe there's a lot of things that went wrong that kind of point to that failure happening, or some off result happening.
It's been a long time since I've listened to our conversation that we had with Jacob, but I will be sad if he didn't mention the Thomas Kuhn's book.
No,
What was it called? The Theory of Scientific Revolutions, or something like
yeah,
that.
something like that.
He's been trying to get me to read that book for like a decade, but I told him, like, at this point we've talked about it so much, I feel like it
Yeah,
would maybe be a little bit of a waste of time for me to read the book.
yeah,
Yeah, it's not a great answer, but
that's
but
funny.
I mean, that's kind of like, from our conversations around this idea, uh, the notion that the way scientific paradigm shifts would happen, think like, um, the revolution around germ theory is a well-known one.
Right.
People think that sicknesses are caused by imbalances in your vitreous humors, but then we figure out, oh, there's these little bugs that are actually making you sick. Um, the way that it actually works is there's a dominant paradigm, a dominant way of explaining how things work, and you start stacking up these anomalies. So and so shoes were tied too tight, they misgrooved it.
Mhm.
Basically, didn't work. Don't know why. Moving on.
Yeah.
But you stack up enough of these, and you can't really deny it anymore. And you
Yep.
start to go, okay, something in my explanation of the world is not quite right. You know, Uh, yeah, I'm with you. I think that that's a good place to focus our efforts. And I think if you can get all those little details right, this is something else that I've kind of been. I can't quite put my finger on why this would be the case, but I get a sense that the small details matter in a disproportionate way once you have like the big rocks in place. You know,
Yeah.
like the basics of, hey, make sure that you're showing up consistently and you're following the program and you're applying significant effort, and like, yeah, okay, got it, all that stuff. And if you are screwing up that stuff, but you got your nutrition dialed in, that's probably not going to make a whole bunch of
Right.
difference, right? But you take the guy who's got everything zeroed in, and then
Mhm.
they get their nutrition zeroed in too.
Yeah.
It seems to have like this outsized effect that you wouldn't otherwise expect, or at least that's how it appears from where I sit. And I think, man, how many things are there that are like that? Is it like powerlifters are famous for taking obscene rest intervals, right?
Yeah.
Like, what would happen if you got your shit together and got your rest intervals
Yeah.
at the place where they ought to be?
Right.
Does that have an outsized impact too? Like, probably not if you're in the beginner intermediate stage, but hey, you've got all this other stuff in place. You've done most of what you can do from a technical mastery standpoint, and on and on. Like, maybe it's got more of an effect than you might think.
It's interesting because Josh and I talk about this a lot. The difference between powerlifting and weightlifting from the perspective that relative to each other in powerlifting, it's very much a game of like really finding ways to exploit the training process, and there seems to be way more of a focus and an attention given to perfecting all of the details around the sport, right? Like you see way more elaborate training programs and people implementing and trying things and research, like there's just way more focus in that regard. In weightlifting, it's much less so. And I think we kind of surmise that the reason is because, for example, the technique in powerlifting becomes solidified and pretty consistent with everybody pretty quickly, right? It's pretty easy to do those movements, and gross technical errors can be fixed really quickly in someone's career. And so then it becomes a matter of like, well, you've maximized your technical abilities. Like there's nowhere to go. You can't squat higher. You can't shorten your range of motion anymore. And you're maximizing, the greatest use of muscle fibers you can. In weightlifting, like it's so much more that cloud of potential errors can exist just in the technique and the execution of the lifts, but also like in like, your mood can affect how you train. Your like you can come in and just feel kind of slow, and that has a negative impact on your lifting that day, or your technique feels off. And so it just seems like there's so much less of this focus on how can we really dial in the little details. And that's probably bigger as you go down the qualification ladder, right? The top people have dialed in those things, and so those things matter significantly to them. But as you go down, like the more beginners, it's like, well, you just have to like not jump forward 2 feet, and your snatch is going to be better.
Well,
Whereas
creating space for them to practice that,
right,
I mean, once you have the space, sometimes it just takes some time.
yeah,
I mean, it's interesting too, because I've talked to people before about like this idea of like looking at programs, or some people want to have like secret programs and stuff
yeah,
like that. And I think, man, there's nothing that I could write on this piece of paper where you would look at it and just go, "Oh my God," right? Like this is it. You know,
yeah,
it's all in like the application of a tool to a problem.
yeah.
And if the problem is, hey, you just need more time to practice the thing, then it might be a fairly simple tool until that problem comes along a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah, a lot of times, like I always try to like a philosophy I've adopted, as of late is the idea that the idea that execution is like ideas are not really valuable. Execution is valuable. And
Mm,
so we can have as many ideas and thoughts as we want and conceive of how to do things or have all this knowledge, but it's ultimately always going to come down to the execution of that, right? Where if you can create the greatest system or the perfect program, but you can't execute it, then it's not worthwhile, right? And so it's like the execution is the most important thing. And it kind of goes back to the powerlifting thing where like you've knocked out every little thing you can, all the low-hanging fruit is gone. It's now a matter of like executing the smallest details as best you possibly can to maximize your ability to, to win or to lift the weight you're lifting. Where it's like just execution as a whole in weightlifting is like it leaves a lot to be desired for a lot of people, right?
yeah. Good luck getting
Yeah,
to the mastery level here, right? Yeah.
right.
Yeah. So, Mike, Max mentioned that he and his partner created an app that takes control of a lot of the programming pieces so that it can like pull in data and then put out data and try to get that closer to what the athlete needs. And then, the person who came to mind when I was thinking about this in a powerlifting context was you. And I was like, oh, this seems exactly like something Mike Tuchscherer would do, given that it's, the you're getting the changes as they happen, and that's being integrated in some way and influencing the program the next day or the next week or the next month.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought about coming up with some sort of like systematized AI driven app or program or something that could take all of the data that's coming in and better sort it and utilize it so you can scale to larger numbers of people?
Yeah. Um, Gosh, so it seems like once a quarter or so, I end up talking to somebody about something like this, and we end up running into some snag, right? That in itself is a complicated project to try to bring to life. Uh, do you have the person with the right skills that are, can they do what they say they can do?
Mm-hmm.
Is one problem. The cost of implementing it, can you implement it in a way that's usable, is another problem. But then there's like some technical problems too, like with like data cleanliness is a big one.
Yeah.
That somebody logs their squats as squat, except now and then they'll log it as squat with a belt or squat with knee sleeve. They're just irregularities. People are, how do you log misses? Well, this person logs it as 11 RPE. That means miss. And this other person logs it as something else, right? Like they just ignore the miss rep and just log the reps that they made. Well, like how does all that stuff affect the overall outcome? Well, I mean, somebody's got to get in there and
Yeah.
clean all that stuff up. And so I've definitely thought about it. I've run into a bunch of roadblocks with it. It would be nice to work on. Bryce Lewis talks about this problem a little bit, and like one thing that he mentions that I think is kind of a neat idea would be like from a coach's perspective. Like, what if you had a tool that would kind of feed you information? Like what if you could see, hey, um, lifters with their training volume uh, this far above baseline, you know, they improve their 1RM 70% of the time. They also
Mm-hmm.
get injured 40% of the time,
Yeah.
and like, is that a risk that you're willing to take or not? And that kind of information would be interesting.
Yeah.
Uh, a lot of knowledge and expertise required to come up with systems like that, I think.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing, right? Because it's like, I think about this, like, what would I want to help me? So I talk to, like, I'll talk to, our gym is, we're in Oakland, right? So we're like, everybody in our gym is some kind of engineer, right? They all work for Uber or Facebook or Google or whatever, right? And so I'm always the dumbest person in the room by far. And I'll talk to people and I'll be like, okay, so I'm talking to this engineer at Uber, and I'm like, okay, so like, what I would love to learn is like, you know, like I want the system to be able to tell me like, hey, here's what the intensity is doing, here's what it's doing and driving results, and how volume is driving results. And he's like, oh, no, you're asking the wrong question. You don't want that. You want to find what the variables are that are driving results. You think you already know them. You
Yeah,
want the data to inform you of what's driving results.
yeah.
It's like kind of funny because I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I can see, like, I'm thinking about it a lot of times from the coaching perspective of, I know the answers, just give me the answer to the question I'm asking, instead of saying, what question should I be asking?
Well, like, a thought experiment that I've done sometimes is, what if it gave you like a really weird answer,
Yeah.
like an answer that like stretches your belief, right? Like, what if you're looking at like, what's the variable that's most correlated with improvements in your squat? And it was like performance on your close grip floor press. Wait a second here. Like,
It's West Side.
like, that would
Yeah.
stretch your ability to believe the system too,
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know how likely that is to happen, but you
Yeah.
could imagine that it's possible, I guess.
It's interesting too, right? Because like I realize a lot of times, like designing the system, it's like you're always designing it with some kind of bias because you're a person, and
Sure.
like as a coach, you've had success with certain things, so you design it in that, it's the child of God designed in his image, right? And it's like a weird thing because I'm like, man, how many things am I just so wrong about that I'm putting into this or building something that's like just this like weird Frankenstein, like, it's this inbred thing that's going to come out
Yeah.
like, no, you won't get any good data out of that because you fucked up at the beginning. And I don't think that's
Right.
the case, but it's a funny thing to be like,
Yeah.
am I actually asking the right questions, right?
You have to contend with that. Like, I mean, if every program that you ever write is 4 days per week, then it's not going to be able to tell you what the
Right.
optimal number of days is.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's an obvious example, but there's plenty of other examples. You know, as I've kind of gone further down the rabbit hole of the system that I've built, you get a lot of variables that are combined from other variables, and they mean something, right? Like
Mhm.
there's a mathematical definition, but then there's like it has a tangible meaning too. Um, but it can be kind of hard to wrap your head around. And I've kind of been confronted a few times. Like there's this one something that you might be familiar with. So we've got this idea of stress index, uh, which is basically like how taxing is a given protocol, uh, in this exercise compared. It's somewhat like number of hard sets, but like easy sets don't count as zero. Ultra hard sets aren't the same as just moderately hard sets. You get the
Yeah.
idea. And then you can further break that down into central stress and peripheral stress, and start to get this understanding of what's the difference between like the mechanical tension that this protocol has given you versus the metabolic stimulus that it's given you,
Mhm.
um, and kind of see where those things exist. And then uh, one way to kind of distill that down is in a ratio. So like I'll look at like a ratio of central stress to total stress, and essentially that comes back to intensity, right? It
Yeah.
just mathematically functions a little bit different, and it's a little bit easier to add the numbers where it's kind of hard to add percent of 1 RM across. Anyway, that isn't
Yeah.
really important. The point is, when I started looking at that variable, I would look at some of these programs that were not working, that seemed like they ought to work, and you go, oh wait, for the last 5 blocks, the central stress ratio has been pretty much the same thing. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, we'll have some blocks that have more heavy work and more light work, and then other blocks are more kind of in the middle. But everything is kind of boiling down to be this really similar intensity. Maybe we're just banging the same note on the drum too many
Right.
times. You know, didn't think of that. It wasn't until like I had the tool to look at that I thought, to change that variable.
That's a really cool idea. Like when it's like we have a lot of variables we talk about: frequency, intensity, number of reps, right? The number of reps in a set, but we you could look at that and see a sort of, maybe that's the noise, which is like to look at this training from the perspective of, oh, you've got this many sets and reps and blah blah blah, but like you're not actually looking at like a like a central stress, right? The central stimulus, which is the signal, right? How stressful, or what is the stress doing microcycle to microcycle or throughout the program, where it's like you're saying, it might just be flat. It might just be this thing that's just kind of not changing, or there's no actual uh like you're not manipulating that enough, one way or the other to get the effect you want. It's kind of an interesting idea um that I hadn't actually thought about, that like maybe a lot of what is going on is just the noise, right? A lot of the things we're playing with is the noise, and we might be missing that signal, which is like some kind of major just stress, like measurement of the stress, to be able to say, okay, yeah, you're just in that same place the whole time.
I like volume is kind of my favorite thing to look at that way, because you ask somebody like, what is training volume? They go sets times reps times load. Well, no, volume is a concept. of
Mhm.
like the quantity of work. And that's one way to calculate a number that, technically tonnage that we say approximates your volume, but there's other ways of doing it too, and they all have these strengths and weaknesses, but volume itself is this concept. And we could come up
Right.
with other ways too. And intensity is no different. Effort, these concepts, and they're somewhat nebulous, and the way that
Yeah.
we define them will definitely affect the answers to the problems. And like when the rubber meets the road, how much weight, how many sets, how many reps do I do? Yeah, you'll get slightly different answers to those questions. So
Yeah.
yeah, man, like answering those, and then like where do you draw lines on this sort of thing? Okay, so if your central stress ratio is going to be whatever 90% for this block, what does it need to be next block? Is a 10% swing, is that enough? Like, dude,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know. Like these are, we didn't even know this thing existed 10 minutes ago.
Right. 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 It's interesting too, because you would have to assume too, like the execution of an exercise, is going to be like have an impact on that, right? So like
Absolutely, yeah.
eccentric deadlifts, right? Like if you do, like it'll have an immediate impact in that like you're not going to use the same number of reps at the same intensity if you're doing something like an eccentric or whatever. And then like the magnitude of that stress is different than it would be, for anything, non-eccentric. So it's like this funny thing that like, you know, exercises, the way they're done, the performance of these things, the impact they have on that it would be really interesting to track a lot of that, to
Yeah.
try to, I mean, I think what's cool, like I was going to ask you before, like if someone was able to say, hey, Mike, we can give you, you know, insight, the answer to any question you want. You'll have the absolute answer. Like, what would be the thing you'd want to know to be like, okay, if you could track something about an athlete, like I would just want to be able to understand and quantify fatigue or like, whatever it is. Like, is there a variable? Is there something that you would say, if I had the answer to this, I think it would really give me a tool to improve, the way I coach people? And it's almost funny because it's like, well, we know that if there is something, it would be, you're gonna have 100 other questions outside of that. But
Right.
yeah, it's interesting, like where those blind spots are.
I mean, it's kind of a fractal system, because like your example of fatigue is probably what I would have said in uh, around like the 2018
Yeah.
2019 timeframe. As the guys on our team were probably getting sick of these like Slack missiles that I was writing, because it would be like, a couple times a week I'd write several pages just insane ramblings about
Yeah.
fatigue, like, well, if this then that, and the world is really flat, and just kind of going nuts about it. But like I felt like there was this predominant narrative, and this could be my misinterpretation, but this is just kind of how the world looks to me. That at the time, a lot of what I was hearing is fatigue isn't the thing that you care about, right? That it doesn't cause any of the adaptations. It's this unwanted byproduct. And I remember thinking like that something's not right with this to me, and trying to figure this out. And kind of where I ended up after a long time of thinking about it is what we said earlier, that there's a bunch of different kinds of fatigue. So it's funny because like if we had this conversation in 2018, I would say, yeah, I want to know,
Yeah.
I would want to understand fatigue, and the computer is going to spit back the answer of like, does not compute, because there's a bunch of different, like what kind of fatigue,
Yeah.
like, and I would imagine that it's going to fractionate again,
Yeah.
if you look with a little bit more detail. But that's just kind of, unfortunately, how it seems to go.
Yeah.
What would you ask, Max?
I don't even know. Like because I don't think I know the thing I want to know. Like I don't
Yeah.
know what it is yet. Right. Like there's going to be, yeah, it's what, like I'm stuck in the prison of my own knowledge. So I couldn't reach outside of that to get an answer to something that would actually be useful. I would just be asking questions about things that are going to either confirm my thoughts already, which is not right, or I just be so blind to what actual answer is, what actual thing there is to understand.
Yeah. Well, maybe we do this. We leave the podcast on that.
Yeah.
Have people have a think, and then the next time we chat, we have some sort of convergence on what the correct answer is. Which actually is, you ask them, what question should I ask?
Yeah.
And then you get some elucidation there. Mike, if people are interested in getting Slack missiles, where can they find you?
Reactivetrainingsystems.com is probably the best place. We're active on Instagram and YouTube as well.
Yeah, awesome.
Cool.
Max?
Yeah, you can find me on teamaita.com or Instagram, Max_Aita.
Yeah, and you can find me at Josh_PhilWL, philosophicalweightlifting.com. And we will catch you guys next week on another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.